The emergency department of Fairview Medical Center hummed with the organized chaos of a typical night. Monitors beeped rhythmically, nurses darted between beds, and the air was thick with urgency. Dr. Marcus Bennett stepped into the controlled whirlwind, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. His calm demeanor belied years of experience handling critical situations. A nurse hurried to his side, her face taut with concern. "Dr. Bennett, we've got an urgent case. Karen Whitfield, 56. She's in surgery, but there have been complications," she said briskly. Marcus nodded without hesitation, already focused. He quickly donned his surgical gear and made his way to the operating room. Karen Whitfield had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at home. What was meant to be a standard procedure had taken a sudden turn for the worse. Now it was up to Marcus to stabilize her and save her life. The surgery was grueling, stretching on for hours. Marcus's hands remained steady and sure, his focus unwavering despite the exhaustion that began to creep in as the minutes ticked by. He tuned out the noise and the mounting pressure, pouring every ounce of his skill into the task. Finally, as the clock pushed past midnight, he peeled off his gloves and surveyed his work. Karen was stable, and her prognosis was promising. She would recover fully. He left the operating room not for applause or acknowledgement, but to move on to his next patient. Saving lives was routine, but not long after, his pager buzzed with a message that Karen Whitfield had regained consciousness in the recovery room. Karen lay propped up on the hospital bed, her face etched with pain. As Marcus stepped into the room to check on her, her gaze immediately snapped to him. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, her expression hardening. "You," she spat, her voice sharp and full of venom. "I want to see the real doctor, not you." Marcus remained composed, though her words carried a sting he knew too well. Years of enduring similar encounters had prepared him for this moment. He took a step closer, standing at the foot of her bed with calm professionalism. "I'm Dr. Bennett. I performed your surgery, Miss Whitfield," he said evenly. "Your condition was critical, but you pulled through. You're on the road to recovery." Karen's lips curled into a sneer. "This is recovery? Look at me," she snapped, pointing to the bandages on her abdomen. "I've never felt worse. What did you do to me?" Her words dripped with disdain, but Marcus held steady, his tone measured. "The surgery was a success. Your vitals are stable, and your healing is on track. Recovery takes time, but you're progressing as expected. I'll check on you again in a few hours." Karen's expression soured further. "I don't want you checking on me," she exclaimed, her voice rising. "I want someone who knows what they're doing. I'm not some charity case." Marcus let the moment hang in the air, his silence giving her words space to echo back. Then, in the same calm tone, he replied, "You are receiving the best care available. If you would prefer a second opinion, I can arrange it." Karen huffed, turning her face away from him. "Get me someone else," she muttered. "I want to talk to the hospital director, someone who actually knows what they're doing." Marcus nodded once, his expression unreadable. "I'll inform the director of your request," he said quietly before leaving the room. As he walked down the corridor, Marcus felt the familiar weight of frustration settle in his chest. He had encountered patients like Karen Whitfield before. No matter how many lives he saved, for some people, his skill, his professionalism, his humanity would never be enough. They only saw the color of his skin. But Marcus Bennett had weathered storms like this before, and though the sting was fresh, he knew it wouldn't be the last time. Still, he resolved to continue doing what he did best, saving lives, no matter the cost to his own pride. "People like you always think you can get away with anything," Karen Whitfield snapped, her voice brimming with contempt. Dr. Marcus Bennett's jaw tightened, but he kept his face impassive. He had heard this kind of accusation before, and he knew better than to respond in anger. Reacting would only fuel her rage. Karen wasn't done. "I've dealt with doctors like you before," she continued, her tone venomous. "You think you can stroll in here, do a half-baked job, and walk away because you don't like the way I look? I'll make sure you lose your job for this. Mark my words." Marcus maintained his composure, his voice calm and measured. "I'm sorry you feel that way, Miss Whitfield, but I can assure you that I've provided the best possible care." Her face twisted in anger. "You don't get it, do you? I want to speak to the hospital administrator, someone who knows what they're doing, not you." She spat the words with venom, her disdain clear. Marcus didn't flinch. He nodded once. "I'll inform the administrator of your request," he said evenly. "In the meantime, if your pain increases, please let the nurses know. I'll be back to check on you later." As he turned to leave, her voice followed him down the hallway, sharp and full of venom. "You better believe I'll make sure they hear about this. You won't be working here much longer." Later, Marcus sat across from Dr. Angela Harrington, the hospital administrator, in her small but tidy office. She listened intently as Marcus relayed the situation. Her brow furrowed in thought as he spoke. "She's been like this since she woke up," Marcus explained. "I've gone over her case multiple times. Everything is progressing as expected. Her vitals are stable, and her recovery is ahead of schedule. But she's convinced I've done something wrong and blames me entirely." Dr. Harrington sighed, rubbing her temples. "This isn't the first time we've had a patient like Miss Whitfield. These kinds of accusations are baseless, but when someone like her stirs the pot, it can escalate quickly if we're not careful." She glanced at Marcus, her gaze softening with sympathy. "You've done everything right, Marcus. We both know that. But she's clearly not going to let this go." "I know," Marcus said quietly, his frustration tightly controlled. "She demanded to speak to you. I told her I'd pass on the message." "I'll talk to her," Dr. Harrington agreed, leaning back in her chair. "But you should know she's already making threats. She mentioned getting you fired, and I wouldn't be surprised if she's considering a lawsuit." Marcus nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. "I've been through this before," he admitted, a trace of weariness in his voice. "I just want to make sure the facts are clear." "They are," Dr. Harrington assured him. "I'll handle the administrative side of things. You just keep focusing on your patients. We'll deal with Ms. Whitfield, but don't let her get under your skin." "I won't," Marcus replied, though the pressure was palpable. He knew all too well that even baseless accusations could create ripples that were hard to contain. Back in her private room, Karen fidgeted in bed, the tension thick around her. Every groan and sigh was exaggerated, every movement designed to draw attention. She muttered under her breath, her anger simmering as she awaited Marcus's return. Her eyes flicked to the door at every sound, expecting him to appear. Each time a shadow moved past her doorway, her lips curled in anticipation, ready to launch another tirade. The nurses moved around her room with quiet efficiency, careful not to engage with her constant outbursts. By the third day of her stay, the atmosphere in the hospital had noticeably shifted. Karen's relentless complaints had cast a pall over the staff. Nurses sighed heavily when her name came up, reluctant to face another confrontation. Even those who passed her room felt the tension in the air. Through it all, Marcus remained focused, carrying out his duties with the same quiet determination. He refused to let Karen's hostility distract him from providing the care she and every other patient in the hospital deserved. Dr. Marcus Bennett had encountered patients like Karen Whitfield before, angry, entitled, and unwilling to accept help unless it came from someone who aligned with their preconceived notions of what a doctor should look like. But this time, the stakes felt higher. Each morning as he approached her room, he braced himself with a steady resolve, knowing exactly what awaited him on the other side of the door. When Marcus entered Karen's room that morning, the familiar tightness in his chest made itself known. Her glare pierced through him as she lay in bed, her face flushed with frustration. The deep frown on her lips spoke volumes. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "I want to see someone else," Karen demanded, her voice sharp the moment Marcus crossed the threshold. "Not you. I've had enough of you." Marcus kept his posture relaxed, his tone measured. "Miss Whitfield, I understand you're upset, but I'm here to check on your progress. Your recovery is going well, and you should be discharged in just a few days." Karen scoffed, throwing her hands in the air in an exaggerated gesture. "Discharged? You must be joking. I feel worse than when I came in here." She pointed a trembling finger at him. "And I know it's because of you. You messed me up. My pain's worse, not better." Marcus opened her chart, his expression calm as he reviewed her latest results. "Your vitals are stable, and your surgical site is healing well. The discomfort you're feeling is a normal part of recovery. If the pain is too much, I can adjust your medication." "You can adjust nothing," she snapped, her voice rising. I don't trust you. I never did. How do I know you even did the surgery right? You people always think you can get away with anything. The emphasis she placed on you people was clear, and it cut deeper than her accusations of malpractice. Marcus paused, allowing her words to settle in the air. She wasn't just questioning his skills. She was questioning his right to exist in her world as her doctor. I assure you, Miss Whitfield, your surgery was performed according to standard procedures, and your recovery is progressing well. My priority is your health, Marcus replied, his voice steady and unwavering. You're lying, Karen exclaimed, her face reddening with fury. You've been lying this whole time. I can feel it in my bones. You did something to me, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. Marcus met her gaze calmly. If you'd like a second opinion, I can arrange for another doctor to examine you. But I've done everything in my power to ensure your recovery. Karen's lips twisted into a cruel smile. Oh, I'll get a second opinion, all right, she sneered. I'll get one when I sue this hospital for every penny it's worth. Her threat hung heavily in the air between them, her eyes flashing with a newfound sense of power. She had found her weapon, and now she intended to wield it. I'll be back later to check on you, Marcus said evenly, turning to leave. Oh, you'll be back, all right, she called after him. But it won't be to check on me. It'll be to pick up your things, because you'll be out of a job. Dr. Angela Harrington sat across from Marcus in her office, her brow furrowed in thought. He had just finished explaining Karen Whitfield's latest outburst, her threats of a lawsuit now fully on the table. She's escalating, Dr. Harrington said, drumming her fingers on the desk. I've spoken to legal. While there's no real case here, she could still cause a lot of trouble. Even baseless lawsuits can harm the hospital's reputation. Marcus remained quiet, processing the weight of her words. He had done nothing wrong, but Karen wasn't interested in the truth. She had found a way to weaponize her prejudice, and now she was intent on tearing him down with it. Dr. Harrington's tone softened as she continued. You've done everything right, Marcus. We both know that. But she's not going to let this go easily. Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. I've been through this before, he said quietly, a hint of weariness in his voice. I just want to make sure the facts are clear. They are, Dr. Harrington assured him. I'll handle the administrative side of things. You focus on what you do best, caring for your patients. We'll deal with Miss Whitfield, but don't let her get to you. I won't, Marcus replied, though the pressure weighed heavily on him. He knew all too well how accusations, even unfounded ones, could ripple outward. As Marcus left Dr. Harrington's office, her words of support followed him. But deep down, he understood that Karen Whitfield wasn't done. She had set her sights on him, and the storm wasn't over yet. Dr. Harrington watched him leave, concern etched into her features. That evening, Marcus returned to Karen Whitfield's room. The routine was familiar now. Check her vitals, confirm her healing progress, and brace for her inevitable barrage of complaints. The moment he walked in, Karen was ready. She clutched her side dramatically, her face twisting in exaggerated pain. Ow, she cried, wincing as though he had struck her. What did you do to me? Marcus frowned, stepping closer to examine her incision. It was clean, healing properly, with no signs of complications. But Karen continued her act, gasping and moaning as if the pain were unbearable. I'm in agony, she yelled, her voice growing louder to attract attention from the nearby nurses. You did this to me. You've made me worse. Miss Whitfield, Marcus said calmly, your incision is healing as it should. I can adjust your medication for the pain, but this is a normal part of recovery. No, it's not, she shouted back. You botched this. You're trying to get rid of me, aren't you? Well, I won't let you. I'll sue you. I'll sue the entire hospital. The nurses nearby exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to respond to her escalating accusations. Marcus, however, kept his focus. I'll have someone check in on you later, he said evenly. For now, please try to rest. As he turned to leave, her voice lashed out behind him, sharp and venomous. You won't get away with this, Dr. Bennett. I'll see to it you're out of here for good. You'll never work again. By the time Marcus reached the nurse's station, the tension in his shoulders was palpable. It wasn't the long hours of work that wore on him. It was the relentless weight of Karen Whitfield's accusations and the sting of her words. Her threats echoed in his mind, over and over. Greg Walker, the hospital's security chief, approached him, his face etched with concern. "I heard she's causing more trouble," Greg said. Marcus nodded, rubbing his temple. "She's not letting up. Now she's threatening a lawsuit." Greg shook his head and crossed his arms. "People like her, they think they can bully their way through life. Don't let her get to you, Doc. You've done nothing wrong." "I know," Marcus replied, though the words did little to ease the pressure in his chest. "I just want to get through this without it blowing up." Greg gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "The hospital's got your back. If she tries anything, we'll handle it." Marcus managed a small nod of thanks, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Karen Whitfield wasn't just an angry patient, she was on a mission, and she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. 2 more days passed, each one beginning with a strained sense of dread. With every sunrise, Karen's hostility grew sharper, her accusations more pointed. She complained to anyone who would listen: nurses, hospital staff, even other patients who happened to pass by her room. Her room had become a battleground of threats and outrage, each encounter draining the energy of those around her. Marcus, ever professional, maintained his composure, but the constant barrage was beginning to take its toll. Despite his resilience, the weight of Karen's relentless campaign loomed heavily over him, making every step through the hospital feel like a trial. Karen Whitfield's discharge day had arrived. Dr. Marcus Bennett reviewed her chart one last time, ensuring every detail was in order. Her incision had healed well, her vitals were stable, and though her recovery had been slow, it had progressed exactly as expected. She was medically ready to leave. But Marcus knew the battle wasn't over. He entered Karen's room that morning, bracing for yet another confrontation. Karen was sitting upright in bed, her arms crossed, her face locked in a scowl. If anything, she looked more ready for a fight than for discharge. "You're being discharged today," Marcus said calmly, his eyes meeting hers. "Your recovery has gone well, and you're fit to leave." Karen glared at him, her lips curling into a sneer. "Discharged? You think I'm just going to leave like this? I'm not going anywhere until I get what I want." Marcus raised an eyebrow but kept his composure. "Miss Whitfield, you've recovered from your surgery, and the hospital has provided the care you needed. It's time for you to continue your recovery at home." She shook her head, her face flushing with anger. "I don't trust you. I don't trust any of you. I know you've been trying to get rid of me this whole time, but I'm not leaving until I talk to someone who actually knows what they're doing." Marcus's voice remained steady. "The hospital administrator is aware of your concerns. You've already spoken with her, and she supports the treatment plan. You've been cleared to leave." "I don't care what she says." Karen's voice grew louder, her frustration boiling over. "You people are all in on this together. I'm not leaving until I'm sure you haven't done something to me that I don't know about." Marcus paused, carefully weighing his next words. "Ms. Whitfield, if you refuse to leave, we'll have no choice but to involve hospital security. You've been discharged, and staying here any longer would prevent other patients from receiving the care they need." Her eyes flared with fury. "You wouldn't dare!" Marcus didn't flinch. "Security will escort you if necessary. It's your choice." The room fell silent for a moment. Karen's chest heaved as she stared at him, her expression a mix of anger and calculation. She seemed to weigh her options, considering how far she could push this. Then suddenly, she leaned forward, clutching her side in an exaggerated display of pain. "Ow! Ow!" she cried out, wincing dramatically. "You see what you've done to me? I can't even move without feeling like I'm going to collapse. And now you want to throw me out like I'm garbage?" Marcus didn't respond to her theatrics. Instead, he turned to the nurse standing by the door. "Please call security." Minutes later, Greg Walker, the hospital's security chief, appeared at the doorway. His tall frame filled the entrance as his calm but firm eyes locked on Karen, who was still holding her side as though in unbearable pain. "Miss Whitfield," Greg said, his voice polite but authoritative, "you've been discharged. It's time for you to leave the hospital." Karen looked up at him, her face twisted in a mix of defiance and fury. "I'm not going anywhere. I have a right to stay here until I know I'm fully recovered." Greg sighed and stepped further into the room. "Ma'am, all the necessary procedures have been followed. You've been cleared by your doctor. If you refuse to leave, we'll have to escort you out." Her expression hardened as she crossed her arms defiantly. "Go ahead, try. I'll sue this entire place into the ground. You're not getting rid of me that easily." Greg remained calm. "That's your decision to make, ma'am. But right now, you need to leave the premises. We don't want to escalate this any further." Karen sat back, glaring at both men with arms still tightly crossed. "I'm not going anywhere." Greg exchanged a glance with Marcus, who gave a subtle nod. This wasn't going to end peacefully without intervention. Greg signaled to another security officer waiting outside. Within minutes, Karen's belongings had been gathered, and she was placed into a wheelchair despite her loud protests. Her angry tirade echoed through the hallway as Greg calmly wheeled her out of the hospital. "You think this is over?" Karen shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus, who stood near the nurse's station watching from a distance. "This isn't over. I'll ruin you." Marcus remained still, his face neutral, but the weight of her words settled heavily in his chest. This battle was far from over, and Karen Whitfield wasn't going to let it go quietly. "I'll be back," Karen Whitfield shouted as the security team wheeled her out of St. Helena Medical Center. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did to me. I'm going to ruin you." Dr. Marcus Bennett kept his expression neutral, though her venomous words settled heavily in his chest. This wasn't the first time a patient had threatened him, but the malice behind Karen's accusations felt deeply personal. She wasn't angry because of any mistake he had made. She was determined to tear him down because of who he was. As the echo of Karen's voice faded, the tension that had gripped the ward for days began to dissipate. Nurses exchanged relieved glances, their shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like an eternity. The atmosphere lightened, and Marcus allowed himself a brief moment of quiet as he moved back to his office. Later that afternoon, as Marcus reviewed patient files at his desk, a soft knock interrupted his focus. Dr. Angela Harrington stepped into the room, her expression weary. "I heard what happened," she said, taking a seat across from him. "Greg filled me in on the situation." Marcus nodded. She wasn't going to leave on her own. Dr. Harrington sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not over, though. Legal just informed me. Miss Whitfield is planning to come back tomorrow with a lawsuit. She's not letting this go." Leaning back in his chair, Marcus let the weight of the news sink in. "I figured as much," he said quietly. Dr. Harrington studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've handled this with more patience than most people would, Marcus. I know this hasn't been easy." "I'm used to it," Marcus replied, his tone steady but edged with fatigue. "It's just exhausting." She nodded, empathy softening her features. "We're with you, Marcus. The hospital is fully backing you, no matter what she tries to do." "Thank you," he said, his voice subdued, but the tightness in his chest remained. He knew Karen wasn't done, and he braced himself for the battle that lay ahead. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the hospital quieted for the night, Marcus found a rare moment of stillness in the staff lounge. The weight of Karen's threats, her relentless accusations, and the underlying prejudice in her words pressed heavily on his mind. He had done his job, and he had done it well. The truth was on his side, but knowing that didn't make the situation any easier. The following morning, the hospital seemed unusually calm. But Marcus knew it was only the calm before the storm. Karen had made her intentions clear, and he had no doubt she would follow through. By mid-morning, the glass doors to the hospital swung open, and Karen marched into the lobby with the same fury etched into her face. Her movements were purposeful, her body tense, with the determination of someone who believed she'd been wronged in the worst possible way. Beside her stood a younger man, her lawyer, who carried a leather briefcase and an air of calculated authority. Ignoring the receptionist's attempts to assist her, Karen stormed past the desk, heading straight for Dr. Harrington's office. From his position near the nurse's station, Marcus watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening. The receptionist, visibly nervous, quickly called security, and within minutes, Greg Walker arrived, moving toward Karen and her lawyer. Marcus stood back, observing the commotion, while preparing himself for the inevitable moment when he'd be dragged into the confrontation. Inside Dr. Harrington's office, the tension was thick. Karen sat stiffly in a chair across from the hospital administrator's desk, her lawyer standing beside her, arms crossed. Dr. Harrington's expression was calm but firm as she addressed them both. "Miss Whitfield," she began, her tone measured, "I understand you've returned to discuss your concerns. However, as I've explained before, Dr. Bennett provided you with the best possible care. Your surgery was successful and you were discharged in stable condition." Karen cut her off with a shrill voice. "Best care possible? He nearly killed me. I've been in pain ever since I left this place, and I know it's because of him." Dr. Harrington's gaze didn't waver as she replied, "Miss Whitfield, your records show that your recovery has progressed as expected. There's no indication of any complications related to your surgery. Every standard procedure was followed, and Dr. Bennett's work was exemplary." Karen's lawyer interjected, his tone cool but firm. "Miss Whitfield's experience tells a different story. She's been in significant pain, which we believe is due to negligence on Dr. Bennett's part. We intend to pursue this matter legally." Dr. Harrington leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped on the desk. "You're welcome to pursue this, but I assure you that our records, as well as Dr. Bennett's exemplary track record, will demonstrate otherwise. The hospital stands by his work completely." Karen's face twisted in anger as she leaned toward Dr. Harrington. "You're all covering for him. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of care you give here. This isn't over, not by a long shot." Dr. Harrington remained calm, her expression resolute. "Ms. Whitfield, I understand you're upset, but baseless accusations won't change the facts. We're prepared to defend the hospital and Dr. Bennett against any claims you choose to make." Karen stood abruptly, her lawyer quickly gathering his notes. "You'll regret this," she hissed before storming out of the office, her lawyer trailing behind. As Marcus stood by the nurse's station watching Karen and her lawyer leave, Greg Walker approached him. "That was quite the show," Greg said, shaking his head. Marcus exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest still heavy. "It's far from over," he replied. Greg placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Maybe not, but you've got the truth on your side, Doc. She's got nothing but noise." Despite Greg's encouragement, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the storm Karen Whitfield had brought wasn't done wreaking havoc just yet. Outside, Marcus stood near the nurse's station, listening to the muffled voices coming from Dr. Harrington's office. His heart pounded, but his face betrayed no emotion. He'd faced confrontations like this before, yet the accusations always felt heavy. The blatant disregard for truth weighed on him, a burden he never asked for but was forced to carry. After what felt like an eternity, the office door opened. Karen stormed out, her face flushed with anger. Her lawyer followed closely behind, scribbling notes in a small pad. Dr. Harrington stepped out after them, her expression calm and unchanged. "Dr. Bennett," she called, motioning for him to come over. Marcus approached with measured steps, his face unreadable. Karen's glare bore into him, her eyes brimming with venom. "Miss Whitfield," Dr. Harrington began, her tone firm but polite. "This is Dr. Bennett. He's more than willing to explain any part of the procedure or your recovery that you have concerns about." Marcus turned to Karen, his voice calm. "If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. As I've explained before, your recovery was typical for this type of surgery. There were no complications and you were discharged once you were medically stable." Karen sneered. But before she could respond, her lawyer stepped in. "We'll be pursuing this in court, Dr. Bennett. I suggest you prepare yourself. You won't be able to hide behind hospital protocols once this goes public." Marcus kept his tone even, though frustration simmered beneath the surface. "There's nothing to hide. I stand by the care I provided. You were treated according to the highest medical standards." Karen's face reddened, her voice rising. "You'll regret this. You people always think you can get away with anything, but not this time. I'll ruin you." Marcus's gaze didn't waver. "I did my job and I'll continue to do so. The facts will speak for themselves." Her lawyer cast a cold glance at Dr. Harrington. "We'll be in touch with the hospital's legal team." With that, Karen and her lawyer turned and stormed out, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air. Dr. Harrington turned to Marcus, her voice soft. "She's not going to let this go, but we'll deal with it. You did everything right." Marcus nodded, though the tightness in his chest remained. The hospital was behind him. but Karen's threats lingered like a wound that refused to heal. Later that day, Marcus sat alone in his office, patient files open in front of him. But his eyes glazed over the words, his thoughts still wrapped around the earlier confrontation. Karen's accusations bore down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He had done his job. He knew he had done everything right. Yet in situations like this, truth often took a back seat to perception. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Greg Walker, the head of hospital security, leaned casually against the frame, his expression calm as always. "You okay, Doc?" Greg asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired of all this." Greg gave a small shrug, offering a hint of sympathy. "I get it. People like her, they think they can steamroll their way to what they want. Doesn't matter if they're wrong." Marcus managed a faint smile. "It's just exhausting, you know? No matter what you do, it feels like it's never enough." Greg nodded. "But you've got the truth on your side and the hospital's with you. She's got nothing but noise." Marcus offered a faint smile. "Thanks, Greg." Greg tipped his head in acknowledgement before stepping out, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts once again. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but the shadow of Karen Whitfield's threats loomed over the hospital. Nurses whispered about the confrontation, their hushed voices careful not to reach Marcus's ears, though he could sense the tension. Despite the support from his colleagues and Dr. Harrington, the weight of the accusations lingered, an invisible burden he carried through every hallway. As the day came to a close, and the hospital grew quieter, Marcus found himself sitting alone in the break room, staring out at the fading sunset. The weight of the day pressed heavily on him, but there was some comfort in knowing he had done his best. Whatever Karen tried to do, whatever accusations she threw, he knew the truth would stand. Still, as he watched the last light of the day fade into night, Marcus understood this battle wasn't over. Karen would come at him again, and when she did, he would be ready, steady as ever, standing tall in the face of her rage. The next morning, the hospital seemed unnaturally calm, but Marcus knew it was only the quiet before the storm. Karen had been relentless in her pursuit to ruin his career, and now that her lawsuit was officially underway, the weight of the fight ahead felt more tangible. Marcus had expected the lawsuit from the beginning, but hearing the news confirmed by Dr. Harrington days earlier still stung. It felt like a blow, one he couldn't entirely prepare for. As Marcus moved through his rounds, the tension around him became palpable. Nurses, doctors, even patients seemed to feel the undercurrent of unease. His colleagues offered him reassuring smiles, their unspoken support clear, but the burden remained his alone to carry. A week passed, and the legal battle began to take shape. The hospital's legal team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence to counter Karen's accusations of malpractice and discrimination. Marcus knew he had done nothing wrong, but the possibility of his reputation being tarnished still gnawed at him. Then one morning, as Marcus reviewed a patient's chart at the nurse's station, Greg Walker approached him. His expression was unusually serious. "She's back," Greg said, his voice low. Marcus's chest tightened. "Karen?" Greg nodded. "She's here to see you." It wasn't surprising, but the confrontation Marcus had anticipated for weeks now felt startlingly real. Karen had already filed her lawsuit. Why was she back? Before Marcus could gather his thoughts, Greg added, "She's insisting on talking to you personally." Marcus took a deep breath. "I'll handle it." Marcus stepped into the small conference room where Karen sat, her lawyer beside her. Her face was as hard and bitter as ever, twisted with the same resentment he'd seen since the moment she woke up in recovery. Her eyes locked onto him, burning with anger, as though he were the source of all her pain. "You," Karen spat the moment Marcus entered. "You think you can just walk in here like everything's fine after what you did to me?" Marcus felt the weight of her hatred settle in the room, but this time he wasn't going to let it go unchecked. He straightened his posture, his voice calm but firm. "I've given you the best care I could," Marcus said, meeting her gaze. "I saved your life and treated you with the same professionalism I give every patient. But from the moment you woke up, you've done nothing but accuse me of things that aren't true. And you're doing it for one reason, because you can't accept that someone like me was the one who helped you." Karen leaned forward, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "You think this is about race?" Marcus didn't flinch. His voice remained steady as he held her gaze. I know it is. Karen's lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But Marcus wasn't finished. I've worked my entire life to be where I am, Marcus continued, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. I've faced people like you before, people who look at me and only see my skin color. But you, Miss Whitfield, you've gone further. You've tried to destroy my career, my reputation, because you can't accept the fact that I'm the one who saved your life. Karen's face reddened with anger, but she didn't interrupt. You want to believe that I treated you poorly because it fits your idea of who I am, Marcus said, his tone measured but resolute. But the truth is, I treated you with the same care and respect I give every patient. Your recovery went well because I did my job. You're alive because I did my job. The room fell into a tense silence. Karen's lawyer cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the charged atmosphere. Dr. Bennett, he began cautiously, will be proceeding with the case. You should, Marcus interrupted, his gaze still fixed on Karen. Because when this goes to court, the truth will come out. And the truth is, I did everything I could for you. Your claims won't hold up because they're built on hate, not facts. Karen's expression remained cold, but her silence spoke volumes. Her lawyer gathered his papers with curt efficiency, clearly eager to end the confrontation. We'll see you in court, the lawyer said as he stood, ushering Karen toward the door. She threw one last venomous glare at Marcus before disappearing down the hallway. The weeks leading up to the court date were long and grueling. The hospital's legal team worked tirelessly to compile records, interview witnesses, and build a case that would dismantle Karen Whitfield's claims. Marcus continued his work as usual, but the weight of the lawsuit never fully left his mind. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, it came with a sense of finality. Marcus sat quietly in the courtroom, flanked by Dr. Angela Harrington and the hospital's attorneys. Across from him, Karen sat with her lawyer, her expression hard and resolute. Her lawyer opened the case with accusations of negligence, incompetence, and racial discrimination. But as the hospital's defense team methodically presented their evidence, the cracks in Karen's story began to show. One by one, the hospital's attorneys dismantled her claims. They presented Marcus's impeccable record, the thoroughness of his care, and the undeniable success of Karen's surgery. Medical experts testified to Marcus's professionalism, and patient records demonstrated that Karen's recovery had progressed exactly as it should. As the truth became impossible to ignore, the courtroom grew quieter. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier confidence giving way to unease. The judge listened carefully to both sides. But as the hospital's case concluded, it became clear that Karen's accusations were baseless. In the end, the judge delivered the verdict. The case was dismissed. Karen's claims of negligence and racial discrimination were deemed unfounded, and her lawsuit was thrown out. Marcus sat quietly as the words sank in. Relief washed over him, but it was accompanied by a lingering sense of exhaustion. He had known the truth would prevail, but the battle had taken a toll. Later that evening, back at the hospital, Marcus stood in his office, gazing out at the city as the fading light bathed the skyline in warm hues. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Dr. Harrington stepped inside, her expression warm and calm. It's over, she said gently, her voice tinged with quiet satisfaction. The judge dismissed the case. You're in the clear. Marcus nodded, the relief settling deeper now. I knew we'd win, he admitted, but I didn't think it would be this draining. Dr. Harrington smiled softly. You handled this with more grace than anyone could have expected, Marcus. We're proud of you. Thank you, Marcus replied, his voice quiet but sincere. As Dr. Harrington left, Marcus remained at the window, taking a deep breath. The battle was over, but its weight lingered. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, but for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. He had faced Karen Whitfield's accusations head-on and emerged stronger, standing tall in the light of truth. As night fell, Marcus took one last look at the city through his office window before turning away. The battle had been won, and the truth had prevailed. But the scars from Karen Whitfield's hatred lingered, a stark reminder of the challenges he still faced as a black doctor in a world that wasn't always fair. For now, though, he could breathe a little easier. The storm had passed, and he had come through it stronger. standing tall despite everything that had been thrown at him. Marcus had thought that winning the lawsuit would bring a sense of closure, a clean break from the stress and hostility that had weighed on him for weeks. And in many ways, it had. But as the days passed, he realized that victory wasn't an end. There was no magical reset button to erase the ordeal or the emotions it had stirred. The wounds, though invisible, still ran deep and hadn't fully healed. A few days after the court hearing, Marcus returned to the familiar routine of hospital life. He moved through his rounds, greeted patients, and consulted with colleagues as he always had. Yet, an unspoken tension lingered in the air. One afternoon, while Marcus reviewed a patient's chart at the nurse's station, Greg Walker approached with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Greg began, leaning against the counter, "I've been thinking about how this whole thing went down." Marcus glanced up, curious. "What do you mean?" Greg crossed his arms, his expression serious but calm. "That lawsuit. The way Karen Whitfield came after you. It wasn't just about the surgery. We both know that. It was bigger than that. People like her. They're not used to seeing someone like you in a position of power. That's why she tried so hard to take you down." Marcus nodded, understanding Greg's point, even as the truth of it stung. "It's not the first time I've dealt with it," he said quietly. "But it's exhausting. I did everything right, and it still wasn't enough." Greg looked at him, his gaze steady. "It was enough, Marcus. More than enough. You beat her. You didn't let her win, and that's something." Marcus smiled faintly, appreciating Greg's support. "I know. But I guess I just thought that once the case was over, it would feel like a clean break. Instead, it feels like I'm still carrying some of it with me." Greg gave him a sympathetic nod. "That's normal. Battles like that leave scars, but you're still here, and that means something." Marcus sighed, glancing at the chart in his hands. "I guess I just don't know how to shake the feeling." "Maybe you don't have to," Greg said, his tone thoughtful. "Maybe it's not about shaking it off. Maybe it's about carrying it with you and letting it make you stronger." Marcus looked at him, considering his words. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe you're right." Later that evening, after finishing his rounds, Marcus found himself sitting alone in the break room. The sky outside had darkened, and the city lights flickered in the distance. The steady hum of the hospital provided a familiar backdrop. Marcus had always prided himself on his ability to keep moving forward, no matter what. Through the grueling hours of medical school, the unrelenting days of residency, and the subtle, and sometimes not so subtle racism he had faced, he had never let himself stop. But, as he stared out at the city, he allowed himself a moment to simply be. The scars left by Karen's accusations were still fresh, but they would heal in time. And as Greg had said, maybe those scars weren't meant to be forgotten. Maybe they were meant to remind him of the strength he had shown in the face of adversity and the victories he had earned against impossible odds. Marcus exhaled deeply, letting the weight of the day dissipate. Whatever came next, he knew he would face it the way he always had, resilient, determined, and ready to keep moving forward. As he sat lost in thought in the break room, Dr. Angela Harrington walked in, a cup of coffee in hand. She smiled warmly when she saw him, her expression kind yet knowing. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. Marcus gestured to the seat across from him. "Please." Dr. Harrington sat down and took a sip of her coffee. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence before she broke it. "How are you feeling, really?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Honestly, I'm still processing it. I thought once the case was over, it would feel like a weight lifted, and in some ways it has, but in other ways, it's still there." Dr. Harrington nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "That's completely normal. What Karen put you through wasn't just a legal battle. It was personal. It was about your identity, your worth, and your place here." Marcus met her gaze, appreciating the way she understood. "Exactly. It wasn't just about me as a doctor. It was about me as a black man in a position of authority." She couldn't handle that. Dr. Harrington set her coffee down, her tone soft but firm. "And yet, you prove that you belong here. You showed everyone that you're not just here because of your qualifications. You're here because you're one of the best. The hospital knows it, the court knows it, and now Karen Whitfield knows it too." Marcus smiled faintly, though his eyes were thoughtful. "I know. But it's hard not to feel like I'll always have to keep proving myself. Like no matter how hard I work, there will always be someone waiting to tear me down. Dr. Harrington reached across the table and gently placed her hand on his. Marcus, you've proven yourself time and time again. Yes, there will always be people like Karen who try to undermine you, but that doesn't diminish what you've accomplished. You're here because you earned it, and nothing she or anyone else does can take that away. Her words sank in, and Marcus nodded slowly. You're right. I just have to remind myself of that. You don't have to do it alone, Dr. Harrington said softly. We're all here with you. The hospital stands behind you, and we always will. Marcus smiled, a sense of gratitude warming his heart. Thank you. That means a lot. As the night deepened, Marcus left the hospital, stepping into the cool evening air. The city lights stretched out before him, a reminder of the world that kept moving no matter what battles were fought within its walls. He had won this fight, but he knew it wouldn't be the last he'd face. Still, he felt stronger now, more resilient. Greg had been right. It wasn't about shaking off the scars. It was about carrying them forward, letting them shape him into someone even stronger. With each step down the street, Marcus Bennett knew he was ready for whatever came next.